I am most honored, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce, excuse me, Alex, I was introducing the Lambert Lecture. What are you doing here?
Well, I'm a Lambert.
You are? You are my student. Your name is Alex W.L. Churchill.
It is, but my mom's a Lambert. My grandparents are Paul and Mary Lambert, and this lecture is in memory of my uncle, Christopher Lambert.
Well, good heavens. Maybe we should introduce. Good heavens, maybe he should introduce the Lambert Lecture. But, Alex, do you know anything about Christopher Buckley?
Of course I do. I'm a Hotchkiss Sr., graduating in merely 1 week.
Well, I'm a Hotchkiss English teacher. Now, how would you describe Christopher Buckley succinctly and precisely?
He is one of America's finest humorists and satirists.
Very good. I'd say that's an A. We don't let our students off quite that easily. Alex, can you tell me some of the titles of Mr. Buckley's many books?
Miss Consolving, need I remind you, I'm a Hotchkiss Sr., graduating in merely a few days. A few of his titles are God is My Broker, Thank You for Smoking.
Alex, it has to be thank you for not smoking.
No, Miss Consolving. The title is Thank You for Smoking. Little Green Men, The White House Mess, No Way to Treat a First Lady, Wet Work, Florence of Arabia.
I'm sorry, the famous character in history is Lawrence of Arabia.
Miss Consolving, I got this. It's Florence of Arabia. Bloomsday, Supreme Courtship, Losing Mum and Pup, a memoir, and most recently, They Eat Puppies, Don't They? A novel.
Wow! Well, you are an outstanding Hotchkiss Senior. Now, what else do you know?
I know that Christopher Buckley is waiting to be introduced.
I think you should do that, Alex.
Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Christopher Buckley.
I am going to exercise plenipotentiary power and announce the beginning of the summer dress code as of right now. But I wore this tie tonight because my father bought me that tie, and that will make more sense once I begin my really quite scintillating remarks. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Miss Consolving. Alex referred to me as a satirist. This is a tricky word. I was once being introduced to an audience about this size in the Midwest, in the American Midwest, and the entirely gracious and well-intentioned host referred to me as a satirist. And he repeated that word about 4 times in the course of the introduction, which probably had some people in the audience wondering, this was a civic group. It was 11 in the morning, and the audience was mostly blue-haired ladies who were probably left to wonder why the lecture committee had invited a sex fiend to address them apropos introductions and about the author and such, you know those about the author paragraphs on the back flaps of books? Those are the paragraphs that authors pretend they didn't write. Considered the leading voice of her generation, Susan Consolving. No, I didn't write that. Well, after a half dozen or so books, I got bored with those. There wasn't really much to say to begin with, so I just made this one up. And among my other notable, entirely fictional accomplishments, I said he has been an advisor to every American president since William Howard Taft. So I was on about day 10 of a book tour, and these are book tours. Instead of sending these people to Guantanamo, really they just, to be waterboarded, they should just send them on book tour. They would tell you, they would have told us where Osama bin Laden was by day 3. But I was on about day 10, I was walking into an AM drive time radio interview. Now, there is a hierarchy of excellence out there in radio land, and AM drive time interviews are not near the top. These are not occasions for Socratic dialogue. And I walked into the studio, and the host, to describe him generously, was hunched over the about the author paragraph, speed reading, with sort of beetling brow, and I knew right away this was all he would know about me. And he looked up with this sort of querulous look at me. He said, "You were an advisor to William Howard Taft?" And as I said, this was day 10. I was a bit punchy, and I said, "Yeah." Yeah, I was. And the brows beetled now into a sort of from a Neanderthal back to a Cro-Magnon articulation. He said, "Well, so we could talk about that?" And I said, "Yeah." And we did. And I haven't been invited back, but it was kind of worth it. Alex, I'm frankly a little disappointed that you left out of your otherwise gracious introduction my work for William Howard Taft. But I'm in a good mood, so we'll let it go this time. I am very pleased to be here in Hotchkiss, in this splendid auditorium that my gracious hostess, Susan Consulting, said as we were walking down this glorious Swanson staircase here, said, "Actually, this is our second best auditorium." And I said, "Well, that's appropriate." I would like to take a moment and thank Alex's grandparents, Paul and Mary Lambert. As you are now well aware, tonight is an annual event celebrating the life of their son Christopher. Mr. Lambert and my father were at Yale together. This was back in was this the Pleistocene? Or the Precambrian? Back then. At any rate, I have known and loved the Lamberts for longer than I can recall, if that makes any sense at all. This being a lecture endowed by a father in honor of his son, I thought it would be appropriate to talk to you tonight about my dad. His name was William F. Buckley Jr. He died in 2008. And since most of you were born, actually looking out on this audience, this statement is only half true. Since most of you were born, I reckon sometime around 1995, his name might not be terribly familiar to you, but he grew up just over that hill there in Sharon. And he grew up to be a great man, as did his older brother, my Uncle Jimmy, who honors me with his presence tonight here. Whom my dad used to refer to as the sainted junior senator from New York. Despite the fact that he lived in Sharon. He had a pied-à-terre in New York somewhere. By great, I don't mean that in the usual platitudinous way, as in, you know, my dad was a really great guy. I mean it really in the literal sense, and you don't have to take my word for it. You can Google William F. Buckley Jr. In the course of his life, he founded a magazine, wrote nearly 60 books, thousands of articles, over 6,000 nationally syndicated columns, taped 1,506 episodes of his television program Firing Line, which set then, and I think even today, set the gold standard for civil and reasoned discourse on TV. He influenced the course of modern American political history. The Lakeville Journal could, with justification, have run the headline, "Local Boy Makes Good." But being a publication of strict Marxist principle, it never did. But I'm not going to talk to you tonight about William F. Buckley Jr., the writer or controversialist, or William F. Buckley, advisor to every president since William and Howard Taft. No, I'm going to tell you about William F. Buckley Jr., the sailor. He was a man of many passions, and right up there was his passion for sailing. It is especially appropriate to talk to you tonight on that theme because he learned to sail on that vast body of water known as Lake Wanonskopomick. He was, yeah, let's hear it for Lake Maybe the only time in history that those words have been said. He was about 13, I think, at the time, and his little sailboat was named Sweet Isolation. This name had nothing to do with poetic solitude. This was in the 1930s, in the years leading up to World War II, and my father's father was, along with a great many other Americans at the time, a strict isolationist, which is to say he very strongly believed that America should not get dragged into another European war. But his isolationism ended with Pearl Harbor, and his 4 sons all ended up proudly wearing their country's uniform. My Uncle Jimmy was served with the U.S. Navy and was present at a great many engagements in the Pacific, which is part of my great awe for my Uncle Jimmy. And he never talks about it. You have to get him good and drunk, which I urge us all to do after the lecture. But back to sailing. When I was growing up, we lived on a body of water slightly larger than Lake Wanonskopomick, namely Long Island Sound. It's salt, so, you know about those salt waters. Back in those days, my dad owned a 38-foot wooden sailboat. It was a sloop. It was named Pen. This was a name my long-suffering mother found very apt. Looking back, I now understand that my father's greatness was consistent with the way he conducted himself at sea. Great men always have too much sail up. Great men take great risks. More timorous souls like myself, tend to err on the side of caution. When we see a storm coming, we take in sail. We look for snug harbor, not my old man. Or as my mother used to put it, Bill, why are you trying to kill us? Great men are also impatient. This particular aspect showed up most vividly in my father's manner of docking his boats. Most people, when guiding a 10 or 20-ton vessel toward a dock, approach slowly. Not my old man. His technique was to go straight at it, full speed. Why waste time? This made for memorable episodes. At one point in his life, he owned a 72-foot long schooner. It had an 18-foot-long bowsprit. With my father at the wheel, going hell-bent for leather toward a pier, that long bowsprit became a jousting lance. What vivid memories I have of people scattering like sheep at our approach. One time, someone actually leapt off the dock into the water in an attempt to escape. Over the years, my father took out entire sections of docks up and down the eastern seaboard. His crew bestowed on him the nickname Captain Crunch. But there were fun times, too. Oh, yes. When I was 6, my father contrived a treasure hunt. He bought an antique wooden chest and filled it with silver dollars, along with some of my mother's jewelry. It gets better. He and a friend sailed across Long Island Sound one weekend and buried it on a sandy spit called on the chart Eaton's Neck, but which I will always think of as Treasure Island. Pup told me that he had come into possession of an old treasure. It was something out of Robert Louis Stevenson, scratched on thick parchment and blood-red ink. The location of the treasure was indicated with his compass bearings. I couldn't sleep the night before we set out. I was so excited. We sailed across. After digging up half of Eaton's Neck, we found the treasure. I can still remember the thrill as my fingers scraped the chest's wooden lid beneath the sand. When we got home, my father said it would be a nice gesture to give my mother the pirate jewelry. Okay, I said, grudgingly, but I'm keeping the silver dollars. It had been such an adventure that I persuaded my father that there must be another chest buried there somewhere. I was quite persistent, in fact. In due course, he relented and procured another chest, which he filled with another fistful of my mother's jewels, this time adding, without telling her, a few pieces of her prized Queen Anne silver. He sailed across and buried it. On the weekend appointed for the treasure hunt, Hurricane Irene struck. Irene was the Hurricane Katrina of her day. She hit with such force that she rearranged the entire topography of Eaton's Neck, making nonsense of my father's compass bearings on the treasure map. We sailed over the next weekend. We dug and dug and dug. And by the time we were finished, Eaton's Neck looked like it had been ravaged by 1,000 prairie dogs. We never did find the treasure. For all we know, it's still there. How thrilled my mother was to learn that her jewels and Queen Anne were now a permanent geological feature of Eaton's Neck. I wonder what the reaction of the insurance company was. I'm not sure I understand. Was the jewelry stolen, Mr. Buckley? No, we buried it. Is there a problem? The next hurricane landed poor old Panic atop the Stamford Harbor breakwater. My father used that insurance payment, and over the years there were many insurance payments, to buy a successor yacht. This was a sweet 42-foot Sparkman and Stevens yawl, Hong Kong built. She was named Susie Wong in honor of the movie, then current, and she was a real honey, all teak and mahogany and carved Buddhas. Every summer, we would cruise the waters of Maine aboard Susie. Sailing in Maine was always an adventure. The water is, I think I can say this here, scrotum-tighteningly cold. The current swift, the tidal drop pronounced, and the bottom unforgivingly rocky. We would drop anchor, a maneuver called kedging, have a merry kerosene lamp dinner, and then drift off to sleep. Soon, invariably, there would come a sound from under the hull. Thunk. 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 This announced beyond reasonable doubt that our kedge had slipped and we were now positioned over a sharp rock on a falling tide. Depending on how many bottles of wine had been consumed, the grown-ups were not always quick to respond. In due course, my mother's voice would call out in the dark, "Bill, what do you propose to do about that sound?" My mother deserves a word of appreciation here. She was a dutiful yachtsman's wife. In earlier times, the term for this occupation was galley slave. Mum had been raised as a debutante, a beautiful, delicate orchid from Vancouver, Canada. Now she found herself cooking for 8 men aboard a small boat with no hot water and scrubbing the toilet. She would mutter darkly, "I was made for better things." In those non-refrigerated pre-microwave days, a lot of our food came in tins. These were stored below the floorboard in the ship's bilges. The bilges invariably filled with oily seawater, causing the labels to decompose. Page 5. Always good to find page 5. What a surprise. As a result, we never knew what exactly we'd be having for dinner on any given night. If we were lucky, didn't eat more beef stew. If not, we might well dine exclusively on Harvard beets and creamed corn. Some tins contained crepes Suzette. My father, not a cook himself, loved to douse them in copious amounts of Grand Marnier. At the climactic moment, he would drop a match into the skillet, causing a Hiroshima of flame to lick the cabin top. Again, my mother's voice was heard. "Bill, why are you trying to set fire to the boat?" Some afternoons, my father might say, "Shall we have lobster tonight?" He'd steer for the nearest lobster pot. As a child, I found this thrilling beyond belief, for it was established lore that a Maine lobsterman could legally shoot you dead on sight if he caught you plundering his livelihood. After laborious heavings on the line, the trap would come up, suddenly alive with frantic jackknifing lobsters. The trick was getting them out without having them clamp down on your fingers. My father would then put 2 bottles of whiskey into the lobster pot as payment. I always wondered what the lobsterman thought. Upon bringing up his trap, to find 2/5 of Johnny Walker Black inside. Did he scratch his head and say, "Reckon Mr. Buckley is back"? Sometimes we barbecued on a little grill that hung off the transom. One night, as I was cooking 6 expensive filet mignons that my mother had asked me please not to burn, the grill suddenly swiveled 180 degrees. 6 expensive filet mignons and charcoal briquettes plopped hissingly into the dark, swift waters of the Penobscot Bay. It was either rescue the filet mignons or another night of Harvard beets. No one ever had finer incentive. My friend Danny and I grabbed a flashlight and leapt into the dinghy. We fired up the outboard and roared off into the night. The current was running 5 knots. It was tricky work corralling those fugitive filets. we ran a few of them over with the outboard propeller, turning them into Salisbury steaks. No one asked for salt that night. Such were our adventures. Larger ones loomed. My father had always had the notion of sailing across the Atlantic. And this we did in 1975. The story is told in his book, Airborne. We set off from Miami on June 1st. A month and 4,400 miles later, we dropped anchor in the shadow of Gibraltar. He told me on that trip how to navigate by the sun and the stars with a sextant. It's a skill that today, in the age of satellite navigation, fewer fathers impart to their sons. As I look back, it seems to be one of the most elemental and fundamental skills a father can teach a son, finding out where you are using the tools of our ancestors. I was 23 now. I'd spent a year between high school and college working on a Norwegian tramp freighter. I'd gone around the world, been in rough situations among rough people. I'd steered a 20,000-ton ship through 60-foot seas in a force 12 gale in the South Atlantic. So I knew my way around a boat. One midnight, I relieved my father on the 12 to 4 watch. He told me to put on my safety harness. Yeah, I said, I'll get around to it. He let me have it, in harsh words, perhaps the second time in 23 years he'd spoken to me that way. Falling overboard at night in the middle of the ocean without a safety harness is not a thing to be taken lightly. I obeyed, but later that night, still simmering over my affronted manhood, made an entry in the log to the effect that Captain Crunch could take his safety harness and shove it where the sun don't shine. The next morning, upon examining the log, he smiled, delighted at the mutiny. What a trip it was. We sailed into the Azores accompanied by 1,000 dolphins, camped out in the crater of an extinct volcano, sailed through the spot where Nelson sank the French and Spanish fleets, and finally through the place that had once been called the Pillars of Hercules, the end of the known world. We had such a good time, in fact, my father declared that we must sail across the Pacific. Why not? As Puck used to say, he who says A must say B. From Honolulu to New Guinea. We did, 10 years later. I was now 33 and recently married. By the way, I said to my new bride on our honeymoon, trying to sound casual, I won't be around much this summer. She was a pretty good sport about it. The first time I brought her to Stamford to meet my parents, my father insisted on taking us out for a cocktail sail. It was a bright, beautiful summer day, and the wind was blowing about 25 knots with 6-foot seas. She had been in a sailboat exactly once before, on a lake, in flat palm water. The waves crashed over the cockpit, hurling her to the deck. She smiled bravely and said, "Is it always like this?" My mother, hearing this account after we got home, drenched to the skin, acerbly replied, "Yes, with Bill, it is always like that." Off we set across the Great Pacific. We made our first landfall a week later at a strange little archipelago called Johnson Atoll. It is here that the United States stores its most lethal nerve weapons. For that reason, any ship sailing into the harbor is greeted not by lovely ladies bearing leis and rum punches, but by grim-faced Halliburton contractors aiming 50 caliber machine guns at them. Welcome to Johnson Atoll. We made our peaceful intentions clear to the frowning colonel in charge. It was an ironic encounter, for that same day back home in Stamford, Connecticut, Nancy Reagan, then First Lady of the United States, was spending the weekend at our house with my mother. The colonel was totally unimpressed with my father's desperate name-dropping and informed us dourly that we must be on our way. Somewhere between Johnson Atoll and our next port of call, we caught a dolphin, the mahi-mahi type, not the flipper type. We were thrilled at our good fortune, as by now we were down to the detested Harvard beets and squishy, malodorous, rotting fruit. We hauled the fish aboard, a beautiful, shimmering, iridescent creature. I reluctantly prepared to deal the coup de grace with a heavy winch handle. No, someone said, pour vodka into the gills. It deoxygenates them, producing swift, painless death. I did. It shuddered violently for a second or two and then was still. I recommend this protocol. If you don't die at first, keep trying. It's a lovely way to go. We made 3 landfalls on our way to New Guinea, each one something out of Gauguin. After the weeks at sea, we were avid for R&R, for a swim that didn't involve someone having to stand shark guard with an assault rifle, for cold beer and hot showers, for a stretch of sleep longer than 4 hours. But the moment we would drop anchor, my father would look at his watch and say, "Okay, it's 10 o'clock now. Let's say we shove off at 2. Danny and I would look at each other and shake our heads. I was learning that for my father it was the voyage, not the stopping. Great men are not idlers. Their idle is set too high. They're built for speed. I myself was built to lie on the sand and drink beer, be fanned by island ladies. But I am not a great man. And so at 2 o'clock, it was up anchor and off to the next idyllic atoll some 1,000 miles away. I scribbled in my journal, "We are racing through paradise." My father liked that and used it for the title of the book he wrote about the trip. We did, however, manage to convince him to stop for a whole day at a place called Kapinga Marangi. Maybe my Uncle Jimmy got there first. You may not be familiar with Kapinga Marangi, but it's there on the chart, 350 miles northeast of New Guinea. We sailed in over the reef into a turquoise lagoon fringed with white sand and swaying coconut palms. Natives came out in a launch to greet us. This was 1985. "Is there anything you need?" we asked, thinking perhaps batteries, antibiotics, tools. The headman nodded gravely and said, "Among my people, there is a great hunger for video." There was a plane in the lagoon. It was still shiny bright beneath the water. It had been there for 40 years. I scuba dived on it and saw the U.S. Navy markings, the bullet holes that had brought it down, hem-stitched along the fuselage. A quarter mile away was a sunken Japanese vessel, the object, perhaps, of the American plane's last attack. "What happened here?" I asked the headman. He shrugged. "First, the Japanese bombed the crap out of it. Then the Americans came and bombed the crap out of it. And there you have it, World War II, in a nutshell." We were navigating again by sextant and celestial navigation. But my father had always been on the cutting edge of the latest gadgetry. And so we had with us a prototype of a satellite navigation device made by the Trimble Company. My father had gone to enormous pains to procure it from his new best friend, Charlie Trimble. It was the size of a steamer trunk and had, isn't it great the way we condescend on this, technology? I can't believe how big it was. What idiots. But it was the size of a steamer trunk and had more dials and knobs and oscilloscopes than Dr. Frankenstein's entire laboratory. My father would crouch before it for endless hours, twiddling the knobs, calling out numbers to us, which we would plot on the chart. "Where does that put us?" he would groan, hopefully. "Here," I said, pointing to a spot in the middle of the Brazilian rainforest. He was back to basics, to the sextant and the stars, but he preferred those. I can still see him standing on the deck of Twilight, searching the sky for Spica, and Vega, and Deneb, one hand wrapped around a stave for support, the sextant in his other calling out, "Mark." A month after sailing out of Honolulu, we anchored in Kavieng Harbor on New Ireland Island. That night we had a celebration as liquid as the vast Pacific. I toasted him to Pup, I said, who shot the sun, shot the stars, but who most of all shot the moon. This was to be our last long sail together. My father was getting older now, so was I. I was the father of two. Then came the episode of October 1997. We'd made a date the month previous to have an overnight sail to Treasure Island, along with Danny, our old sailing partner. I took the train up from Washington, D.C. to Stanford. Along the way, I looked out the window and saw gray, stormy skies. I checked the weather in the paper. There I saw the word northeaster. To anyone who's grown up along the Connecticut seashore, this is not a word congruent with overnight sail. My father was standing there on the train platform to greet me. This had always been a welcoming sight. Then I noticed through the train window that he seemed to be holding onto a sign, as if for support. Had he injured himself, I wondered? No, for when the train door opened and I went to disembark, a violent gust of northeaster blew me back into the train. I crawled out on my hands and knees. Loose objects in the railroad parking lot were being blown about. "We'll have a brisk sail," my father said. Danny was there with him. I looked at Danny. Danny looked at me. "We're going out in this?" I said, incredulously. "Sure," Pop said, nonchalantly. We arrived at the marina. The wind gauge indicated steady at 45 knots, gusting 50. To put it in context, hurricane-force winds start at 64. "Pup," I said, shouting to make myself heard above the wind, "ought we to be doing this?" "Take in the fenders," he merrily replied. He had brought with him a friend from San Francisco, as it happens. Poor innocent lamb, he had never been in a sailboat before. "Should I take a Dramamine?" he asked. "Nah," I said, "you'll be too scared to throw up." And so off we sailed into the storm. This was in my father's last sailboat, a 36-foot fiberglass sloop named Patito. We somehow made it across Long Island Sound through a screaming dark night at 15-foot seas. I kept the radio tuned to the Coast Guard frequency. I thought of my 2 young children. I thought of my warm bed in Washington. I thought, what the? The next morning, after a sleepless night at anchor, listening to the halyards slap furiously against the mast, dawn arrived greasily. The wind had increased. It was now gusting to 55 knots. The radio reported that 500,000 homes in New England were without power. Various governors had declared a state of emergency. We had gone for an overnight sail in a state of emergency. I proposed that we row ashore and flag down a passing car or perhaps a passing FEMA vehicle. "No, no," said my father, "we'll be fine." It was daylight now, so we could see the seas that we were up against, and there was nothing pleasant about them. Perhaps you've seen the movie The Perfect Storm? Something like that. Somehow we made it back across Long Island Sound. My mother had spent the entire morning on the phone with the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard kept saying, "But Mrs. Buckley, we don't understand. What are they doing out there?" Good question, I thought, gulping down a brandy with trembling hands. I simmered for a few days and wrote my father a blistering letter. Never again. Since then, I've taught my own son to sail. I remember the first time I placed his small hands along with mine on the tiller and taught him the feel of the boat and the wind and the sea. I thought back to when my father had first taken my small hands in his and taught me the rudiments of the same art. Now I was imparting to my son what my father had passed along to me, something elemental, thrilling, and joyous. My father is gone now. I wonder, as he approached the pearly gates, no doubt at the same speed he used to approach the pier, did the angels scatter? I often find myself thinking back to that night in 1997, an experience I desired never to repeat, but now I think I would give almost anything for just one more sail together, even on a howling northeaster. A gone shipmate, like any man Joseph Conrad wrote, is gone forever, and I never met one of them again. But at times the spring flood of memory sets with force up the dark river of the Nine Bends. Then on the waters of the Fourline stream drifts a ship manned by a crew of shades. They pass and make a sign in a shadowy hail. Haven't we together and upon the immortal sea wrung out a meaning from our sinful lives? Goodbye, brothers. You were a good crowd, as good a crowd as ever fisted with wild cries the beating canvas of a heavy foresail, or tossing aloft, invisible in the night, gave back yell to yell through a westerly gale. Thank you very much.